a déjà vu Pénélope Fillon travailler comme assistante parlementaire.
À travers Pénélope, on cherche à me casser.
Kids are involved as well.
Comment l'extrême droite française? Marine Le Pen a dévoilé ce week-end à Lyon ses 144 engagements.
Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at The Listening Post. Here are some of the media stories we're covering this week. With the winds of change blowing across Europe, we examine the coverage of the coming election in France. The party leading the polls in Italy is led by a comedian who says the coverage there is a joke. His party is providing some of its own. The Al Jazeera journalist behind bars in Egypt. More jail time, still no charges. And new alternative facts from the Trump administration on the terror attack that never actually happened.
And they were the masterminds behind the Bowling Green massacre.
After the electoral process is one a presidential election, the other a referendum that shook the U.S. and the U.K. in 2016. The role of the news media in this year's French presidential elections bears watching. Just last week, the leading candidate on the right, François Fillon, told reporters he was the victim of a media campaign of unheard-of violence. He was referring to a story broken in an often satirical magazine called Le Canard Enchaîné about his wife being paid taxpayers' money for what appears to be an imaginary job. Further to the right, Marine Le Pen of the Front National has been watching with interest. Her party's journey from the political fringes to the center of attention has been aided by a noisy far-right subculture on social media that has her back. This is all rather troubling for the French political establishment, having seen Donald Trump triumph, even as he was painted as a proxy for Vladimir Putin and the Kremlin. The same narratives, fake news and the Russian menace, are now gaining traction on social media. It seems that all that's missing in the political story unfolding in France is the middle ground. Our starting point this week is Paris. It was one of those stories, one of those rare pieces of journalism that changed the dynamics of an election campaign. Simple and easy for audiences to grasp. A politician's wife on the government payroll for 13 years with no real job description. The François Fillon story has featured on all French news platforms, ricocheting across social media. But it got its start in a weekly newspaper, a French institution that's more than a century old and barely has a presence online.
Le Canard Enchaîné has a huge impact. It's the most profitable newspaper in France, even though it doesn't contain any advertising. Ministries employ people to read it every Wednesday morning to check what it's saying.
Il est notoire qu'au Canard Enchaîné, on a...
Everyone knows that Le Canard Enchaîné is often used by politicians to settle scores. It's actually the go-to media outlet for politicians. If you have evidence against the candidate you want to take down, you give it to Le Canard Enchaîné and you know it will be published.
Et on sait qu'il arrivera à bon port.
Il y a eu d'abord Le Canard Enchaîné.
First was Le Canard Enchaîné. Then Mediapart, Le Monde and BuzzFeed all publish information about Fillon's parliamentary assistant. Because once the first revelations come out, other journalists will dig up further information on the story, which creates this impression of intense media attention on François Fillon. Then he defends himself, calling it a campaign against him.
Une campagne contre lui.
Mais lyncher, assassiner politiquement, comme finalement vous l'avez fait, pendant 10 jours, un candidat à l'élection présidentielle, je pense que ça pose un problème.
C'est comme tous les candidats à la présidentielle qui se disent anti-système.
It's like all presidential candidates who are presenting themselves as anti-system. It's a popular image for voters who have had enough of the elite, who have had enough of the dominant narrative, and who do not trust the dominant media. This is totally paradoxical because they transmit this message at a press conference, filmed by all the television networks and in front of 200 journalists.
If you set yourself up in opposition to the media, break with them, then you're no longer seen as being their ally. You become a rebel on your own path. Something that Marine Le Pen has always understood well.
C'est ce qu'a toujours compris Marine Le Pen.
If any party stands to benefit from the troubles of a leading conservative candidate like François Fillon, it would be Marine Le Pen of the far-right anti-immigrant Front National, the FN. Unlike the populist parties that have recently sprung up in Germany and Italy, presenting fresh challenges for journalists there, the FN has been on the ballot in France for 45 years.
Bonsoir Marine Le Pen. Bonsoir.
Although the party still takes issue with what it calls hostile coverage from mainstream news outlets, its leader is proving far more skilled at the media game than her father ever was.
Her most extreme positions are covered quite badly by the traditional media, especially by broadcast media, who are concerned not to be too divisive, so they don't emphasize strongly her extremist views.
Est-ce que pour vous, le candidat Fillon doit renoncer à la campagne présidentielle?
There was a time when this was justified, as they only represented 10% of voters. This position is harder to maintain today, when polls are showing 20, 25%, even 30% or more in some areas.
La différence, simplement, c'est que le Front National...
The difference is that the Front National is much more presentable now. It's not about denouncing people from North Africa or black people anymore. The narrative is now more about sovereignty, which is much softer. The difference between Jean-Marie Le Pen and Marine Le Pen, the father and the daughter, is the directness. Jean-Marie was bold enough to express his opinions. Marine usually holds back.
Marine Le Pen, elle a souvent tendance à faire marche arrière.
In a way, Marine Le Pen can afford to pull back, knowing that there are other elements online saying the kinds of things her father used to say. A host of far-right sites and voices offer incendiary opinions about immigrants and the politicians deemed sympathetic towards them. Some are clearly fascists who support the FN and who dwell in what has come to be known as the fascosphere.
The fascosphere launches attacks on all rival candidates by creating a fake account with a Muslim first name followed by the candidate's last name: Farid Fillon, Ali Juppé, Bilal Hamon, Mohamed Macron. The message is that all candidates except Marine Le Pen are pro-Muslim, too weak with Islam and Islamism, and this idea that every single Muslim is a potential terrorist.
Disons que c'est un double mouvement.
So it's a parallel strategy. On one side there is the official campaign in which the Front National is very good, and then there are militants, not necessarily members of the party, who will conduct the kind of campaign the Front National will probably not carry out themselves because it's too xenophobic or Islamophobic.
Ou des choses comme ça.
France also has a fake news problem. Former Prime Minister Alain Juppé, who lost in the primaries to François Fillon, said he was disgusted by false stories circulated online linking him to the Muslim Brotherhood. Fictional articles relating to the 2015 terror attack in Paris have also made the rounds. The details were gory, offensive, and untrue. Facebook has approached traditional French news organizations like Le Monde in order to harness the paper's fact-checkers to flag the site when questionable stories appear. The idea is to get the fact-checkers up and running before the election rather than after, as has happened elsewhere.
Facebook a déjà lancé cette initiative aux États-Unis.
Facebook already launched this initiative in the US and wants to launch it in Germany. They launched in the US after the election of Donald Trump because the role of fake news was the subject of intense debate there. For us, with social media platforms like Google, Facebook and Twitter serving as vehicles for false information, passing itself off as journalism, we, with our expertise and journalistic experience, want to work directly with Facebook and bring our editorial experience to bear through this tool.
C'est quelque chose dont...
This was proposed by certain media outlets some time ago, but it is open to criticism. Of course, the media outlets involved in these initiatives themselves make mistakes sometimes, like all the media. So people who are opposed to this fact-checking system can use this as a line of attack, saying that this media or that media made a mistake.
Pourquoi on devrait leur faire confiance maintenant?
Why should we trust them now?
Other media stories that are on our radar this week. For the fourth time, Egypt has extended the imprisonment of an Al Jazeera journalist who has yet to face trial. Mahmoud Hussein, an Egyptian national based at the network's headquarters in Qatar, was arrested December 20th after arriving in Cairo for a holiday. Egypt's interior minister has accused him of incitement against state institutions and broadcasting false news with the aim of spreading chaos, but offered no specific evidence and formal charges have not been laid. The Egyptian authorities have repeatedly put Al Jazeera journalists in the dock. Last year, the former editor-in-chief of the Arabic channel, Ibrahim Halal, was sentenced to death in absentia for endangering national security. 3 others, Bahar Mohammed, Peter Gresta, and Mohammed Fahmy, each spent more than a year in a Cairo prison before eventually being released early in 2015. On the incarceration of Mahmoud Hussein, Al Jazeera has condemned it, saying all accusations against him come as a result of legal practices in Egypt that his human rights organizations have repeatedly stated violate international norms and conventions. In Kenya, a group of international human rights organizations, 9 of them, are calling on the government there to allow for the return of a British journalist deported 2 months ago. Jerome Starkey is the Africa correspondent for the Times of London. In December, he was arrested at Nairobi airport upon re-entry and eventually expelled. A spokesman for the Kenyan government later said it was all about the paperwork and that the renewal of his work permit had been rejected. Starkey's reporting has touched on such issues as security, miscarriages of justice, and drug trafficking. The rights groups say that Kenyan journalists are increasingly subjected to harassment and interference. They include Dennis Galava, the former managing editor of the Daily Nation's Weekend Edition, who was sacked for an editorial he wrote early in 2016 critical of the government. Amnesty International was among the organizations signing a letter to government officials saying in the run-up to elections and beyond, Kenyan authorities must publicly declare their commitment to freedom of the press and show that they mean it. U.S. President Donald Trump has accused the media there of covering up terror attacks just days after one of his spokespeople appeared to make one up.
It's gotten to a point where it's not even being reported. And in many cases, the very, very dishonest press doesn't want to report it.
When pressed on what Trump meant, the White House released a list of 78 terror attacks around the world, saying most did not get sufficient media attention. Many of those cases, like San Bernardino, Boston, and Nice, got wall-to-wall news coverage. The list did not include any attacks perpetrated by non-Muslims, like the 2015 shootings in Charleston, South Carolina, by a white supremacist. Trump's claim followed comments made by his advisor Kellyanne Conway on MSNBC, in which she talked about 2 Iraqi refugees who she says were the masterminds behind what she called the Bowling Green Massacre, an attack that never happened.
Most people don't know that because it didn't get covered.
Conway took an absolute beating on social media over that particular alternative fact. Then this new website popped up for anyone wanting to donate to the victims of the imaginary massacre in this time of need. Those clicking on the Donate tab were sent straight to the fundraising page of the American Civil Liberties Union. Following on from our previous piece from France, 2017 will be a big year for elections across the EU. Italians have just had a constitutional referendum, and they are expected to vote in an election sometime this year, probably in June. That's because Matteo Renzi's government fell after backing the losing side in that referendum. The referendum campaign, like many an electoral process these days, was pockmarked with allegations of misinformation and fake news from both sides. Italian politics has a big new player, a populist party called the Five Star Movement, which is led by a comedian, Beppe Grillo. Like other populist movements, Grillo's relies on anti-establishment rhetoric and a strong social media presence. When accused of trafficking in fake news, rather than putting its hands up, Grillo's movement prefers to point fingers at the Italian mainstream news media, part, Grillo says, of the same establishment his party is out to overthrow. The Listening Post's Paolo Ganino now from Rome on the rise of the Five Star Movement, its media machine, and Italy's battle over fake news.
December 2016. After losing a constitutional referendum he bet his political career on, Matteo Renzi resigned as Italy's prime minister. A few days later, he spoke to his party about the defeat.
Abbiamo perso sul web. Abbiamo totalmente lasciato la parte web nelle mani di chi in queste ore è sotto gli occhi della comunità internazionale, a cominciare dal New York Times, per essere diffusore di falsità.
He was pointing the finger at Italy's main opposition party, the Five Star Movement, which fought against him in the referendum, and its activity online.
Beppe Grillo, the maverick comedian that started the populist movement Five Stars in Italy, simply uses the fake news in order to enhance traffic on his website. It is already one of the most popular European websites. They do it on purpose, they do it simply to steer some more revenues. They start sharing them, and then that's when they become radioactive.
The no camp won the referendum by a margin of 20%. Fake news did not determine the referendum result. That said, yes, they did have an impact, especially in spreading hoaxes which were related to the referendum. For example, the hoax claiming that the pencils used in the voting cabins were rigged, and many people believed it. It was one of the most shared stories during the referendum.
Beppe Grillo started his blog in 2005 and saw it grow into one of the 10 most visited in the world. Around that blog, the Five Star Movement has built a sophisticated network of online outlets dealing in news and information. All those affiliated websites are under the same administrative roof, controlled out of Milan by digital consulting firm Casaleggio Associati, which manages the money those sites raise through advertising. It's an informal news network, the existence of which the Five Star Movement denies.
Io sinceramente non ne ho evidenza.
I have no evidence of this constellation of websites. Probably there are some online outlets, but they're not significant in terms of reach, and they have no direct link to the Five Star Movement.
Some evidence is there though, even if it's circumstantial. Those websites share both physical and IP addresses and advertising accounts with official outlets of the Five Star Movement. That online setup was explored extensively by BuzzFeed in the dying days of the referendum campaign, a story the New York Times followed up on. BuzzFeed's report, which said the sites were spreading fake news including Russian propaganda, made headlines. Some of its allegations, though, were a stretch, about articles that were misleading but don't really meet the definition of fake news. Although, Beppe Grillo did post an image from Naples, suggesting it was an anti-government protest, when really the crowd was there to hear the Pope speak. And Setse, one of Casaleggio's websites, which has more than 1 million Facebook followers, claimed that the US was trafficking migrants into Italy, offering no evidence. On the BuzzFeed allegations, the Five Star Movement deflects attention away from its own work and onto that of the mainstream media.
It all started when BuzzFeed wrote this article full of factual errors. It was a targeted campaign against us. There can be mistakes, but the great thing about the web is that you can check the source. If you make a mistake, you lose credibility. Someone can call you out immediately. If they had looked into the fake news problem properly, they would have found that the real offenders are the mainstream media.
Italians are turning to the web for alternative news sources, as only 4 in 10 of them consider their mainstream media to be independent. They look at their public broadcaster RAI and see the influence the political parties exert over it. They look at major private TV networks and the many channels still associated with 4-time Prime Minister Silvio Berlusconi. And newspapers, well, they're known for their overt bias and their links to the economic establishment. It's no wonder digital outlets, alternative voices, are thriving.
There is a gap of what the mainstream public is interested in and what the mainstream media actually covers. So this sense of detachment from the mainstream media has kind of created a distrust in them, which is a terrible thing to do, because then people flocked to very sketchy websites and believe anything they read on Facebook.
2 settimane prima del referendum, ad esempio...
2 weeks before the referendum, La Stampa, a daily newspaper now owned by Carlo De Benedetti, who also owns La Repubblica, completely invented a story about a Twitter account and a cyber propaganda network aimed at undermining the Democratic Party and opponents of the Five Star Movement. This piece was completely made up. It turned out that the Twitter account wasn't linked to the Five Star Movement after all, but the newspaper never felt the need to admit they reported fake news. They never even acknowledged it. This is a serious problem.
E questa è la cosa grave.
C'è una ostilità che...
There's a hostility towards the Five Star Movement that's really more like a gulf of understanding. In other words, the mainstream media simply don't get them. They struggle to understand what they're about. It's the reason why the US media failed to realize that Trump could win the election, and why the Italian media fails to realize that the Five Star Movement could come first or second in our own elections. Traditional media are not equipped to read how reality is evolving.
Italy's antitrust chief suggested that independent state agencies should have a mandate to police false information on the web. The Five Star Movement proposed an alternative plan, a popular jury to decide on whether what's published in the media is true or false.
Sono due estremi, sono due annunci.
These proposals are two extremes and two sides of the same coin. Political opposition is at the heart of all of this. The government, or a majority party, or the establishment, whichever you prefer, suggests a regulatory commission. So Grillo, who is in the opposition because of how things work, needs to take the opposite view.
Deve fare l'opposto.
Sono tutte e due impraticabili.
Both are unworkable. A people's jury would at best give us the kind of audience juries they have in song contests. And unfortunately, the other historical example are the people's juries in communist countries in Eastern Europe, in which the people had very little to do with it. Tribunals, which would make critics fearful and please the authorities.
Le forze di governo speravano.
With no real solution in sight, and with their media caught in the middle of a political battle, Italian news consumers are left to pay the price. Confused about who to trust, they are retreating to their social media feeds, searching for friendly voices. Whether the stories they find are true, false, or even fake doesn't seem to matter.
More voices on the download now on the politics of the media, both alt and mainstream, in Italy.
The Italian populist party Five Star Movement does not simply make use of fake news for its propaganda, but it's entirely based on a fake news website, beppegrillo.it, named after the leader, founder and owner of both the party and the blog. They strongly claim that the real fake news are the ones from mainstream media, like television and newspapers, which led to a huge fight between the media and the movement, and to Beppe Grillo's proposal to create a people's tribunal to decide which news are true and which are not. In my opinion, this, combined to the rising popularity of the movement in Italy, is a serious danger for freedom of press and journalism in our country. Welcome to the post-truth age.
Fake news became a problem worldwide during the presidential elections in the United States last November, and the interesting thing is that the use that Donald Trump makes of internet is in a way very similar to the use that Beppe Grillo has been doing in Italy since years, like reaching people just through his blog, so bypassing media, as Trump is doing through Twitter and YouTube, and through a number of different websites that help him to spread his views and his politics.
Finally, the Five Star Movement is the leading Italian populist party. Ideologically, Five Star is a bit of a mixed bag. Then there's the Northern League on the right. Its leader, Matteo Salvini, is known for making some bold political statements. He once called the EU, particularly the euro, a crime against mankind. His latest show of support for U.S. President Donald Trump and Trump's policy on immigration has Salvini posting a picture online wearing a Trump T-shirt in front of a poster of a Native American which reads, "They suffered immigration and now they live on reserves." Bad idea. Users quickly responded by posting the same image but photoshopping in their own versions of that image, and they ended up getting far more likes than the original. We'll leave you with a few examples, and we'll see you next time here at The Listening Post.